In modern multi-domain warfare, a nation's greatest vulnerability isn't found on the battlefield. It is the fatal arrogance built into its own strategic architecture. Look at the first 48 hours of Operation Epic Fury. Dropping thousands of tons of kinetic payload onto a grid over 1,000 nautical miles away is never an act of impulse. It is an industrial execution. You are taking strings of 2,000-pound precision penetrators from high altitudes and cruise missiles from beneath the waves. You are launching them from entirely disjointed spatial vectors, altitudes, and airspeeds, and you are forcing them to violently converge on the regime's nerve center at the exact same absolute millisecond. That doesn't take rage. It takes something infinitely colder. It requires the absolute unforgiving doctrine of time on target. And into that ruthless kinetic system, the enemy voluntarily fed a suicidal parameter. Why did the IRGC willingly surrender their most expensive, highly touted combat ecosystem into a claustrophobic inner harbor? Why did they expose the massive radar cross-section of their entire surface fleet right under the nose of the United States global sensor grid? To their supreme leadership, it looked like a stronghold. But through the eyes of an American military architect, that wasn't a concentration of power, that was an adversary, permanently locking their own fleet into an inescapable geometric trap. Bandar Abbas was never a fortress. To us, it was purely a target-rich environment, a kinetic reality where the final output is always the same: erasure. The coordinate grid was locked, the execution protocol was fed into the kill chain. If you want to witness exactly how the American industrial war machine surgically dismantled this defensive ecosystem using uncompromising systems design and overwhelming kinetic force, hit the subscribe button to synchronize your data. Welcome to Navy Decoded. But before we can break down the lethal anatomy of this kill chain, we first have to understand the physical iron cage where this trap was actually sprung. The greatest enemy of the US military in this multi-domain campaign wasn't Iran's Bayvar 373 air defense system, nor was it Russian-supplied S-400 batteries. The enemy was space. The enemy was the limit of geography. The distance to reach the core targets was a lethal logistics and combat radius problem, spanning roughly 800 to 1,075 nautical miles. Our machine doesn't need to close the distance to engage. The kinetic payload was released from the furthest edges of the physical map. From the supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford, growling in the eastern Mediterranean. From the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, holding the line out in the Arabian Sea. And from remote strategic bases in Diego Garcia and Cyprus, to decapitate the nerve center of the Iranian Navy at Bandar Abbas. The precision-guided munitions network had to tear through thousands of nautical miles of contested airspace. And the center of that geographical iron cage is the Strait of Hormuz. A mere 21 nautical miles wide at its choke point, yet it is the jugular, pumping 20% of the world's crude oil and LNG into the global economic bloodstream. Sitting right on the southern coast along this narrow strip of water is the Bandar Abbas Naval Base. It's not just a base, it is the nerve center of their heavy surface fleet, and IRGCN swarms, holding Bandar Abbas. Iran held a geopolitical blade right at the global energy artery, ready to suffocate the Western supply chain. However, their strategic thinking had completely rotted from complacency. Instead of leveraging the vastness of the ocean to disperse their strength, they blindly worshipped the doctrine of exquisite platforms. They voluntarily compressed their entire combat ecosystem into a shallow basin and claustrophobic dry docks. The backbone of their surface force, the Muj-class frigates, were entirely stripped of their maneuvering space, their stealth deterrents beneath the waves. The Kilo-class diesel-electric attack subs were forced to expose their fatal vulnerabilities right on the hard stand. Even their ambitious blue-water floating cities, like the 133,000 short-ton Expeditionary Sea Base IRIS Macron or the UAV carrier IRIS Shahid Bagheri, were deadlocked in a tight pier-side geometry. They weren't massing combat power, they were creating a physical saturation point. All of their most expensive war machines turned themselves into silent steel blocks lying dormant, turning this entire basin into a massive electromagnetic bullseye. That is exactly why, through the eyes of the radar cross-section analysts at CENTCOM, Bandar Abbas was no longer a fortress. It was a target-rich environment, an invitation for annihilation. The coordinate grid was set. The death sentence was pronounced. The mainstream media always wonders why Iran's boasted integrated air defense system went completely silent, failing to understand that the sheer overmatch in multi-domain warfare gives the adversary zero chance to react. We don't use raw muscle to break down the enemy's front door. Instead, we reshape the entire physical environment around them. We initiate the kill chain not with a kinetic boom, but by ruthlessly exploiting systemic fragility. At exactly 0945 hours local Tehran time, as the timeline hit zero, a multi-tiered cyber campaign was dropped straight from orbit into the enemy's core data infrastructure, throttling their national bandwidth and forcing transmission capacity into a free fall down to roughly 1%. For the systems engineers controlling the U.S. battle network, this forced civilian bottleneck was explicitly designed to trigger an irreversible cascading failure on a much deeper military level. Because once civilian infrastructure collapsed, desperate traffic instantly spilled over and overloaded all military backup bands, creating a fatal physical fracture that severed the vital command and control nodes from central Tehran all the way down to the naval commanders stationed in Bandar Abbas. When air traffic control screens drowned in lethal white noise and locked out all data streams, the OODA loop of the IRGC top brass was thrown straight off a cliff into total paralysis. Not a single fleet dispersal order was issued. Not a single propeller shaft had time to spool up and escape. The entire fleet was automatically stripped of its maneuverability and locked in place within an incredibly tight pier geometry. That is the ruthless law of modern warfare. When the central brain is blinded and clinically dead, no matter how great the steel muscle is, it becomes nothing more than a silent kinetic target waiting to be vaporized. At the exact moment the enemy's nervous system was convulsing in total disconnect, the second kinetic trap was sprung. The U.S. flooded the airspace with hundreds of ADM-160 MALD miniature electronic decoys, combined with swarms of low-cost Lucas kamikaze drones, generating a data tsunami to overwhelm the processing capacity of every early warning radar site. This wasn't standard misdirection. This was physics manipulation at a subatomic level. The ADM-160 MALDs carry no explosives. Their weapon is pure mathematical deception. The signature augmentation subsystem inside the core of each MALD operates like a reality-bending machine, emitting sophisticated electromagnetic signatures to amplify the radar cross-section of a mere 300-pound object into the massive digital footprint of a B-52 strategic bomber or an F-15E Strike Eagle. For the Iranian radar operators staring desperately at their scopes in sheer panic, the algorithm had perfectly cloned a massive incoming fleet, painting phantom squadrons of F-15 and F-16 screaming at high subsonic speeds straight toward Tehran's airspace. By injecting this massive volume of spoofed data directly into the veins of their air defense network, we forced their fire control computers to solve meaningless equations, completely overflowing their sensor buffers and permanently stripping the system of its target discrimination capabilities. We hijacked their attention, forcing SAM batteries to frantically fire at electromagnetic ghosts, draining their multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles into the empty void. Once highly touted billion-dollar air defense complexes like the Bavar 373 and S-400 were overwhelmed and neutralized by the laws of electromagnetic waves, the system's defensive perimeter was systematically disassembled. The fifth-generation stealth assassins, F-35s and F-22 Raptors, operating under the absolute protection of a broad-spectrum electronic warfare dome generated by EA-18G Growlers, methodically tore open the target airspace without leaving a single ripple on the radar scopes. At this point, Iran's defensive net wasn't just overpowered by brute force, it was being disassembled by our system in the most calculated, surgical, and cold-blooded manner possible.